Today we're looking at the RHDSimulations 767 for MSFS. Just like the Captain Sim 767, this airplane uses default systems. It's also a little more expensive than the Captain Sim, so let's fly it and see how it compares. Jumping into the flight deck, the first thing we notice is that the CRT instruments of the 767 are nicely modelled. So today's flight is from a runway start with engines on, and I'm flying my usual test route of London Stansted to Glasgow. Running through the usual FMC stuff, you can see most of the perf page is already pre-populated. Again, it's using default systems. So we'll click through this, and again we can see of course V-speeds are pre-populated. We'll now take a look at the legs page and we'll see that our flight plan has automatically been pulled through from the world map. There are altitudes pre-populated, so I'll climb, cruise and descent, although it's not really true VNAV, it's just sort of a dumb climb and descent mode. So just like any default plane, if you put this in VNAV mode, the airplane will automatically just climb flat out to your cruising altitude, and then at top of descent it will start to decelerate, but you'll need to manually trigger the descent, which will just again be a flat out open descent to your bottom of descent altitude. So of course from a runway start, flaps are preset, we've dialed in our cruising altitude and we'll activate LNAV and VNAV, we're ready to go. Conditions as we take off are very sketchy indeed, but as soon as we're stable and we have positive rate, we'll bring the landing gear up, and then as we reach around 400 feet, we'll enable the autopilot. So with autopilot activated, the plane starts climbing and starts following our flight plans, and we just decrease the flap setting as we accelerate. As with any default plane, this will hold 240 or 250 knots below 10,000 feet, and it will then accelerate to cruising speed above 10,000 feet. As we climb, we'll check out the progress page. So again, as with any airplane that has default systems, the time to your next waypoint is predicted, but there's no top of climb or top of descent predictions. At top of climb, the airplane levels off correctly, and you see the correct VNAV path annunciator appear on the PFD. At cruise, I run through the usual top of climb stuff. So first of all, the approach ref 30 degrees 104 knots is obviously super inaccurate, way too slow, and the plane will ignore it anyway, like any aircraft with default systems, but we'll enter it all the same. We do this just to make sure we have a deceleration waypoint on our approach. I'll also dial in our bottom of descent altitude, which is 2,400 feet as listed on the legs page. As I mentioned earlier, the plane won't automatically descend at top of descent, we'll need to trigger that a little later on. And I'll check the nav radio to make sure the ILS frequency has been automatically populated, which it has because we selected an arrival runway on the world map. By the way, if you're wondering where the brightness controls for the PFD as well as the zoom controls for the ND are kept, they are on the pedestal right here. Also, if you're wondering why that bottom screen in the centre is blank, you can switch it on with this button here, the secondary engine display. When the airplane reaches top of descent, as I said a little earlier, it won't start to descend, but it will start to decelerate. At that point you hit the selected altitude button, and the airplane will then begin its descent towards your bottom of descent altitude. During descent, as the airplane reaches the Decel waypoint, the airplane will start to decelerate to about 120 knots for approach. As it slows down, just increment the flaps, and eventually you'll be at correct approach speed and flap config, at which point you can drop the gear. And more good news, the plane will automatically correctly level off at bottom of descent as set on the autopilot MCP. Now here's the bad news. As with a lot of planes that use default systems, there is a long-standing bug where as you turn on to final, the plane will begin to just nosedive, and it will entirely ignore VMCP altitude or any altitude hold or VNAV mode or approach mode or whatever you have set. And the only way to fix that is to disengage the autopilot and sort of manually fly it back up to the correct altitude. When you do recover from this, you are able to re-engage the autopilot and activate approach mode, at which point the airplane will start to follow the localizer. However, as soon as you put it back into automatic mode, there is a chance it will just start to descend again before it hits the glide slope. This bug is highly dependent on the route and approach you choose, so if this doesn't occur, happy days, the airplane will then follow the localizer and glide slope correctly. However, in my situation, on this route, on this flight with this plane, I ended up flying the ILS approach entirely manually in thick fog, just following the raw data on the PFD. As ever, obviously autopilot is off, but we'll disengage auto throttle and bring the throttle back for touchdown. The 767 does not float at all, by the way. And that concludes our flight in the RHDSimulations 767. It is yet another nice looking, fairly cheap plane that's hamstrung by its default systems. As for whether you should choose this or the Captain Sim, my opinion would be neither, but this one is nicer looking and the Captain Sim is cheaper. So make your own mind up if you really need a 767 in your fleet right now. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this useful or entertaining, please feel free to drop a like and subscribe, because I make flight sim and other simulation content very regularly. Take care, and I'll see you next time.